now it is time for tonight's main edition. And so I'm going to hand off to Dr. Peter Gardner, who y'all know from his many years of service with the Hypnotic Idea Exchange, and he's going to introduce tonight's featured guest.
Thanks, John. I've introduced Michael a couple of times, never quite sure how to introduce someone who's really defined hypnosis for the past several decades. And I said this last time, I love repeating it. A number of years ago, Jeff Zeig introduced Michael as the Milton Erickson of the 21st century. As I said, I've said that before, and I'll say it each and every time. I just can't imagine a more laudatory phrase. And I need not say anything about his importance to the field.
You know, when he said that, he hadn't slept in 4 days, right?
Beyond writing his textbooks in hypnosis, as so many of us use, soon coming out in its 6th edition, and Michael can say more about that a little bit later. Beyond having published 16 books, Michael, is that right? 16 books.
Yeah, 16 and edited 3 others.
On so many different relevant topics, from depression, mindfulness, and we can go on. Beyond teaching so many people, so many professionals, hypnosis in a very scientific and very data-driven way, I can go on with the beyonds. It doesn't end. Now, for those of you who remember it, because I certainly do, before we had Wikipedia, we had Encyclopedia Britannica. Went out of print in 2012, and it was, to me, it was the authoritative source for information seemingly about almost anything. Michael had been commissioned by Encyclopedia Britannica to write the section on depression. And he also wrote the sections on treating depression and clinical hypnosis in Encyclopedia Britannica, medical and health annuals on a couple of occasions, I believe. On a more personal note, Michael's not just an expert in the field, but a teacher, a friend to everyone he's trained. And frankly, I think that's a greater accolade than books and having trained. But as I mentioned, the 6th edition of will be coming out, of Transwork will be coming out. And what I'd love to hear from you at the end, if we have time, is additions, subtractions from that book, things that we maybe should be aware of. And I'm not going to go on. I wouldn't know where to stop. But there are a couple of things I'm going to put in the chat that I think are important for everyone to know. First of all, Michael's developed Claria, that's C-L-A-R-I-A. I'll put it in the chat. It is a free app for healthcare professionals. It uses hypnosis, CBT, and other empirically supported techniques for managing and teaching skills to manage depression, anxiety, stress. It's composed of, I believe, 12 hypnosis sessions. It's terrific. And again, I'll put a link to that in the blurb. I have another link that I'll put in, that is to a 60-hour training. Was 100-hour, now 60-hour, a little bit of reconfiguration. And again, if there's time after the Q&A, Michael, maybe you could say a couple of words about that as well. And lastly, I'm going to put in the chat, and I can put this in as 3 separate notes in the chat. Michael has some relevant articles he wanted to disperse, so I'll get that out there once he starts speaking again. So again, I could go on. I'm not going to. You want to hear from Michael, not from me. Michael?
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Peter. I appreciate it a lot. Look, the HIE experience, the Hypnotic Idea Exchange, has been something that you've brought to the hypnosis community that I think is invaluable. And so I want to thank you and Dana and John and all the folks who have worked very hard to make this available as a free service to the professional hypnosis community. It's a lot of work. I don't think people really realize how much work goes on behind the scenes. So the fact that you have gotten this running and kept it running all this time, and you've attracted some of the very best speakers and educators. I just want to say kudos to you. Kudos to you all. You've done a great job.
Thank you. And Michael, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing. For the Q&A, please address any questions that you have to me, to Peter Gardner. I'll go through them and ask Michael later on. I'm sorry for the interruption, Michael.
No worries. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate the fact that you want to spend some time with me today, tonight, tomorrow morning, whatever time zone you're in. I am going to be sharing my slides now and telling you really what I have in mind. I intend to talk for about 45 minutes or so and address one of the more challenging aspects of doing clinical work. And that is, how do we get people to be active participants in the therapeutic process when they're really not inclined to do much of anything? I have literally spent the last 5 decades studying depression intensively, the phenomenon of depression, its variants, how it appears cross-culturally. That's of particular interest to me as someone who has had the good fortune to travel the world teaching about hypnosis and teaching about depression. And when there are so many different variations of depression and so many different influences, it's a constant. And it is, of course, the number one mental health issue on the planet, the number one mood disorder on the planet. And it's just one of those things that goes along with depression that people don't really want to do much, if anything at all. And that's not exclusively tied to depression. You know, for a lot of different experiences and conditions, people just don't really want to do much. And so it really has been an ongoing clinical challenge. How do we get people moving who aren't really particularly inclined to get moving? I don't know if you saw this, but last year in the International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis, Ole Paulson and his colleagues conducted an international survey, to date the most comprehensive and current international survey about people's clinical practices. It was tied specifically to practitioners, self-identified hypnosis practitioners, asking questions about how they would characterize the nature of their practice, how they view negative responses to hypnosis, what the most common myths were, all kinds of pretty basic questions about the nature of practice around the world. And it certainly didn't escape my attention that fully 71% of respondents define themselves as being Ericksonian in their orientation. Now that's remarkable. Here is something that occurred over the span of several decades of Erickson's major contributions to the field, all of which were heavily amplified to Jeff Zeig's credit by his organizing the Erickson Foundation and promoting publications in Ericksonian hypnosis and psychotherapy, running the conferences on Ericksonian approaches to hypnosis and psychotherapy. Is there any field? I'm sure there must be, but it's a remarkable thing that one individual's influence has been worldwide so dramatic in changing the face of how hypnosis is conducted. And so people in the survey talked about the fact that they routinely use imagery and metaphors, the indirect suggestions, the kinds of approaches that have come to be identified as being, at least in part, Ericksonian in nature. Now, given the fact that Erickson's work has been so popular, there are really two dimensions of Erickson's work. One is his use of clinical hypnosis. And of course, that's what gets talked about to the greatest extent part of being the hypnotic idea exchange is the focus on the hypnotic side of the equation. And I will certainly talk about the hypnotic side of the equation. And the other side is the use of strategies, psychotherapy. The fact that he would routinely make use of homework assignments, sending people out in the world to do things, often things that were strange, often things that you wonder, how could he possibly get people to do these things? And so that's really what I'm going to be talking about, how to get people moving. And Erickson's way was uniquely his own. He very often would, if you asked him directly, how do you get people to do these weird things that you ask them to do? He had a really simple answer. His answer was, because they know I mean it. Now you can interpret that a lot of different ways.
Excuse me, Michael, I'm going to have to interject again. There are a bunch of messages asking if you can turn your volume up, your sound. I think it's up to us to turn our sound up, or not sure what you can do on your end, but if you can, a number of people have put that in there.
I'm at maximum volume now, but I'll try and increase the volume of my voice, and hopefully that will improve. So the getting people to do things and by saying it globally because they know I mean it, is that because of the force of his personality? Is that because he tapped into people's desire to change and they just needed a path to go down that he provided? Is it about the therapeutic alliance and the strength of it? Is it about the curiosity of why he's asking them to do something strange? You know, we can interpret the vagueness of his response quite in many different ways. Jay Haley was a good friend and mentor of mine for more than 20 years, up until the time that he passed away. And Jay and I had many conversations about this. As you probably know, Jay is the one most responsible for exposing Erickson to a much, much wider audience through his book, Uncommon Therapy. And this is a book that took Jay 5 years to write. He was trying to find a framework to present the unusual approaches of Erickson. And of course, the focus was primarily on the homework assignments that he gave people. And when we talked about the kind of magical atmosphere around Erickson, Jay was really much more realistic, I think. He said, I don't really understand the worship of Erickson, the deification of Erickson. He said, to me, Erickson was just a man who really knew his business. And I like that. I like that notion, because it really is a basic truth that how you approach the use of hypnosis is a reflection of you. It's a reflection of your knowledge base, a reflection of your own biases, a reflection of your training, a reflection of you every time you start to conduct a session. And the big difference between therapists is how they identify the targets of treatment. And Erickson, being a man who knew his business, I think was just better than most at being able to identify the most salient targets of treatment, the one string that you could pull at to make the whole symptom pattern collapse. So the utilization of hypnosis, his emphasis on action, well, that was a very new way of approaching psychotherapy. And this was uniquely something that he started doing from the very beginning in the 1920s, 1930s, things that he was already starting to write about, getting people moving. So that's going to be the topic for today. what are the ways that we might be able to use hypnosis and the context of psychotherapy to help people get out in the world and do some things that can alter their perspective in a meaningful way. I don't think there's anybody who has studied hypnosis who hasn't been exposed to one of Erickson's most famous cases, the African Violet Lady of Milwaukee. If you're not familiar with the case and you want to read Erickson's narrative of the case, then you would find it contained in a teaching seminar with Milton Erickson. That's a transcript of a 5-day training that Erickson did that Jeff Zog edited and published. And what was particularly interesting to me, Erickson's description of what helped this woman. He sent this woman who was living alone, very isolated, never left her home. The only thing that she did was she grew African violet plants. And this was in Milwaukee, not an easy place to grow a relatively delicate plant. So when he saw her skill, he had her go out and actually had her housekeeper go out and buy pots and soil and then do cuttings and then start giving plants to anybody and everybody at the church who had some major event going on, whether it was a wedding or a christening or a birth, whatever. But if we look at it from the standpoint of activation, Erickson did not give a particularly good explanation. All he said about it was that if you're going to have somebody keep track of 200 African violet plants and there really isn't time to be depressed. Well, that's not the best of explanations because being depressed isn't about how much time you have. But if you look at it from the standpoint of how many different levels of activation there were in that single case, there was certainly the behavioral activation of getting her to grow African violets in large enough quantities that she could share them generously at her church every time one of the fellow church members had some event going on. That's a behavioral activation. It's getting her moving, it's getting her doing something. And he got her to do it just through the sheer force of his personality by his own telling. He said, "That's a doctor's order. That's what I want you to do." She complied. The cognitive activation, she had to get out of herself long enough to pay attention to other people's celebrations and identify the significance in their lives of those celebrations. The social activation, as soon as you hand somebody a plant, you're giving them something, you're being very generous, and nobody's going to react angrily to that. People are going to appreciate it. It's going to engage you, and it did. She became very popular. And of course, the emotional activation of amplifying the feelings of warmth, compassion, generosity. And what a great assignment to be able to have multiple levels of activation. And certainly one of the things that I would hope comes out of this short presentation now is that, one, it emphasizes how critically important providing homework is, things for the clients to do in between, but especially how important it is that the assignments you give have multiple levels of activation, not just one, that there are many levels going on at the same time of what this person can experience. If we ask the question, why don't people do the things that are obvious, or at least to you, of what they can be doing and should be doing? Now, I'm not going to read through all these slides. It's why I'm making these slides available to you. You'll have them to read later. But the interesting thing from my standpoint is, I'm retired from clinical practice now, but for almost 4 decades running a practice and focusing on depression in particular, when I was interviewing a client, I would go down 2 paths simultaneously. On one path, I was particularly interested in what this person's personal resources were, so that when this person would share some piece of personal history with me, I'm thinking in terms of, well, what does that say about this person? What strength does that represent? They happen to mention to me casually that they moved from one city to another to take a new job. Well, if you don't think about it, that's just a trivial piece of history. But if you think about it, think about what goes into taking a new job. Think about what it takes to move from one city to the next, what it's like to go through all your things and think about what you're going to give away and what you're going to keep, what's worth taking with you, reaffirming what your values are, letting go of some things that don't matter anymore, what it's like to enter a new situation.
No.
Where you don't know what's going to be happening. You don't know who you're going to meet. You don't know how you're going to function in the job. There are so many things that go into that. So looking for resources is certainly one of Erickson's great contributions. And other people have talked about it in different ways. You know, certainly Abraham Maslow talking about self-actualization, Carl Rogers talking about what it means to become fully human, Martin Seligman spearheading the positive psychology movement. You know, looking for people's resources is a pretty fundamental, I think, core aspect of Ericksonian hypnosis as well as Ericksonian psychotherapy. But the other track that I go down when I'm interviewing someone is I want to know, how has this person managed to stay the same? How is it that this person has held on to this problem for as long as they've held on to it? Now you think about it, every year you meet how many new people, have how many new experiences, read new books, watch new television shows and movies, have conversations with people, hear stories on the news. You're constantly being bombarded with novelty. How does somebody manage to resist that and stay the same? And until you have an insight into the mechanisms of stabilization that this person has, you're going to run into the inertia that precludes the person from fully participating in the treatment that you want them to participate in. So what I have on this slide and the next are 12 pathways to passivity. This is how people stay stuck. And I'm being quite literal when I say, if you don't know this person's pattern for how they stay the same, it's going to be really hard to interrupt that pattern and make therapy progressive. So the emphasis on action, it has been, proven beyond any shadow of a doubt. There's no ambiguity about it. That when we study therapeutic efficacy, which I do routinely because I'm a writer and a researcher, we have evidence upon evidence that it's the therapies that emphasize action in treatment that have the highest treatment success rates and the lowest relapse rates. Getting people moving, giving people homework, getting people to do tasks, even doing things within the sessions themselves. People can feel better in just merely supportive therapy, but they'll do better. And that's an important distinction that I make. The differences between feeling better and actually being better. Feeling better is nice, but it's also more likely to be the basis for relapse. Being better means the person has really integrated the things that you've been teaching them, so that they can go beyond what you've done in the therapy session and engage in what I call generative responses, where the person can respond to novel situations with things that you've taught them and things that they've developed, not just the things that you happen to talk about in therapy. Well, the use of hypnosis to seed experiential learning, the use of hypnosis to introduce action to the person, and then following it up with homework assignments after the hypnosis session ends. And for me, that's really been the 1-2 punch of being strategic in therapy. I'm aware of, here's the kind of perspective this person's going to need to develop. Here are the kinds of skills the person's going to need to develop. Let me use the hypnosis to orient the person to that perspective, and then give them a homework assignment that capitalizes on that. If we have time, I'll give you a case example of what I mean later. The common statements of inertia When clients literally say to you, I know I should, but I can't. Or why should I bother to even try? It'll never change. But I shouldn't have to. No, I don't know why I do that. It just happens. All of these things represent a lack of agency. People need to have that sense that they can take action that's going to yield a productive outcome. Erickson used to say that deeds are based on hope and expectancy. And that's a pretty obvious yet extremely important point. Why would you take action if you don't think it's going to pay off? And that leads us into the realm of expectancy. Now, it's always interesting to me, in the days when I would do live workshops, which COVID has basically brought to an end, I could have 500 people in a room and say, how many of you think it's important for the client to have positive expectations for treatment? And virtually everybody's hand goes up. And then when I ask them, okay, so what exactly do you do to build positive expectancy? You could hear a pin drop in the room. People didn't have a specific strategy for how to do something like that. Well, it starts with communicating the need for action, and that starts with the very first phone call. When somebody would call me up and say, I'd like to see you, here's the problem, and I'd like help with it, I'm orienting the person in the very beginning how you define the therapeutic relationship. Is this going to be a relationship where I am providing you with emotional support? Am I going to be doing psychoeducation and presenting you with information? How's this going to work? And I would always tell people, if you're going to work with me, I'm going to be giving you things to do in every session to do in between sessions. And if you're not prepared to do that, then I'm not the guy you want to see. So if they would then go ahead and schedule the session, they have tacitly agreed that they're going to be an active participant in the therapy process. And then when they showed up for the session, I handed them what I called a service agreement, a written form that literally would say, as your psychologist, here are my responsibilities to you. As my client, here are your responsibilities to me. And they read it and they sign it, and I give them a copy. And so, interestingly, didn't run into the kinds of things that therapists often complain to me about. I gave the client a homework assignment, they didn't do it, what should I do? I had a very high rate of compliance because of what was the foundation of how the relationship was defined. Now, that's an invitation for you to think about, what do you tell your client when they're making initial contact? How do you communicate to them that they're going to need to be an active participant in the process? How does that get solidified so that it is a given that every time you give an assignment that they're going to follow it? Now, there's still an artistry to giving assignments and getting people moving. And initially, of course, I give people really simple things to do. So, for example, this person, through the interview, shares with me an obvious misconception, a belief they have that's clearly wrong. So I will give them the assignment, okay, here's what you seem to believe. Let's find out if that's true. I want you to go to the library and find me 3 articles, or these days, go on the internet and find me 3 articles that state that. Or I want you to call 3 experts and ask them this question and come back. If they come back a week later and they didn't make the 3 phone calls, guess what we're doing now? The session literally stops and we go to the phone and we make 3 phone calls. Now, what am I modeling for the client? What am I telling them about when I give them an assignment? I expect them to do it. So I always had a very high rate of treatment cooperation, what some people call treatment compliance. I prefer cooperation personally, but it's because the relationship was defined that way from the beginning. Now, we want people to take action, but it has to be sensible action. It has to be timely action. It can't just be anything. As his friend points out to him, that is not one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. So the very first task that we face then in treatment, no matter, as far as I can tell, no matter what problem you're addressing, the first task in treatment is to shift the person from a stable to an unstable attributional style. In plain language, we need to build expectancy. We need this person to know that their symptoms are malleable. Think about how people come in feeling stuck. Nobody comes in and says, well, I've only had this problem for 4 days, but I want to nip it in the bud. People, by the time they come in, they've had the problem for months, if not years. And they've tried to change it and failed. They've maybe seen other therapists. They've talked to their dog. They've talked to their hairdresser. They've done all the things that they know how to do, and nothing's changed. So the fact that there's an element of hopelessness is hardly a surprise. And the key point I'm making is, why would this person do the things that you want them to do? Why would they even come back for further sessions if they don't believe that things can change? This is one of the greatest benefits of hypnosis. Even if you are a remarkably mediocre hypnotist and all you know how to do is go 10, relax, 9, deeper, 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 8, relax, 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 7, going deeper, 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 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Even if that's all you know how to do, it's still worth doing. You spend 15 minutes doing a Mickey Mouse hypnosis induction, and what happens? The person's breathing slows down, their musculature relaxes, blood pressure goes down, pulse rate goes down, rumination curtails. The person now has direct experiential evidence that their experience is malleable. That is the start of creating the shift to an unstable attributional style. If you're not familiar with that language, stable attribution, the person believes it will always be this way, it's never going to change. Unstable attribution, the person believes that it is in fact changeable. And that's what we're trying to do, is use hypnosis as well as homework assignments to very quickly get things moving and create new qualities of experience. And in particular, the reason expectancy is so critically important is because it literally regulates every aspect of the treatment process. Why would I seek treatment in the first place if I don't think it's going to help? How can I possibly progress quickly if I don't even think progress is possible? Why would I follow the treatment plan and do a seemingly silly homework assignment that if I don't think it's going to help? It determines whether someone's going to respond partially or fully, and it predicts the person's vulnerability to relapses. So I am encouraging that literally in the first session, second session at the latest, that you're introducing hypnosis right off the bat. I'm always amused when people say, well, I won't do hypnosis with people right away. I think you have to have a lot of information and build a really strong therapeutic alliance before you can do hypnosis. And I say that you are limiting yourself unnecessarily if you adopt that position. Why not use hypnosis to build the therapeutic alliance? Why not create an experience for the person that is so calming and so trusting and so easy and so beneficial that the alliance is strengthened literally on the spot? Well, we're not going to have time to do the exercise, but you'll have it in your handouts. Here is a generic structure for building expectancy. And for those of you, many of you that are here on this call, this Zoom meeting now, are past students of mine. Hi, everybody. And you know that I'm a strong fan of having structure. I like the idea of having structure to sessions, but also spontaneity to sessions. But the idea is to plan to be spontaneous so that you have the opportunity to divert when you need to, but you have a general structure that creates a flow to the session. That's how deepening occurs naturally during the course of the session. There's a flow to it, and there's a flow to the ideas. So this particular strategy is one I have found very valuable to do in the first or second session. And there are just very specific messages I want to get across that are part of this strategy. The first message is the past doesn't predict the future. The second is you have more resources than you realize. And the third is take action now with tomorrow in mind, not yesterday in mind. One of the things that Erickson said that struck me like a thunderbolt, now I never had the opportunity to meet Dr. Erickson, unfortunately. He passed away while I was on his wait list. But he said quite famously that people don't come to therapy to change the past. They come to change the future. And I believe that with all my heart. So obviously hypnosis can be structured and applied in lots of different ways. This person does hypnosis, this person does hypnosis, and they're not doing anything that remotely looks similar. So that's what I meant earlier when I said how you use hypnosis is going to be a reflection of your assumptions and your viewpoints. Well, what we're striving to do always, of course, is we want to absorb the person in a way of thinking about things that's consistent with what they're trying to accomplish. When we look at what the benefits of hypnosis are, there are lots of great reasons to do hypnosis. It's still so unfortunate that hypnosis is underutilized. The hypnosis societies in the United States have a diminishing membership, which is very troubling. It stands in stark contrast, especially to European countries where hypnosis is on the ascendancy, where for annual meetings, they're having literally thousands of people show up, a much greater appreciation for it. I am not quite sure why that's the case. I can make an educated guess that in some ways, I think our emphasis on trying to research hypnosis and prove hypnosis and make hypnosis an empirically validated treatment has worked against the greater atmosphere of hypnosis, which is it's about subjectivity. It's about subjective experience and altering subjective experience. And I think the gap in perspectives is most evident in this international survey that I referenced earlier, where you have 71% of practitioners adopting a model of hypnosis that is anything but empirical. Dan Short's come the closest to developing an empirical basis for understanding Ericksonian work, but it is not objective in nature, and it doesn't easily lend itself to research protocols, because the whole point of an Ericksonian approach is you can't standardize an induction or a treatment. So it's not quite as heavy an emphasis on empiricism in other places. And while we've been thinking, this part's editorial, forgive me, that while we've been thinking that we need more research, I've just spent the last year updating Transwork, new 6th edition, over 100 pages of references. There is lots of great research out there, but it hasn't changed people's minds about hypnosis by and large. We're all still having to counter people's misconceptions. We're still spending way too much therapy time explaining what hypnosis isn't and what all the myths are and why those are misconceptions and how clinical hypnosis is going to be different than stage hypnosis and all that nonsense that we end up spending way too much time doing. So I would much rather that we if we're going to validate anything empirically, that instead of empirically validating therapies, I'd rather that we empirically validate therapists. So the one of the factors that clearly works against people taking an action orientation is the coping style known as rumination. Now, all of you have knowledge of what rumination is about. Susan Nolan Hoeksma was at Stanford University, and she did seminal research on gender differences in depression, which is how I crossed paths with her. And then she ended up leaving Stanford to go to University of Michigan, happens to be my alma mater. And then she ended up at Yale. And if you're not familiar with her work, you really should be, because there is no one who offered a more clinically salient mechanism of action orientation than she did through her very comprehensive research on rumination as a coping strategy. Now, she published dozens and dozens and dozens of really hardcore research articles, which you'll find in the journals. But she also wrote a book for the general audience. The book was called Women Who Think Too Much. And despite the gender specificity in the title, it's really a good book for anybody who thinks too much. Susan unfortunately passed away at much too young an age. We lost one of the great intellects in the field when she passed away. But certainly she offered us insights into the world of ruminators, how ruminators actually believe that they're gaining insight by thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking at the expense of taking action. Typically, they often have a history of trauma, which has functionally paralyzed them, why they don't take action. They don't feel like they have the power to do that. They think that they're facing absolutely uncontrollable stressors. And they engage more in pondering why they feel bad. And if we're going to ask the salient question of ourselves in dealing with ruminators, it is a discrimination strategy. Now, many of you know my book, The Discriminating Therapist, one of my most important books, I believe, talking about how the inability to make meaningful discriminations leads people to make mistakes. If you can't distinguish, for example, what's controllable and what isn't, you're going to make the mistake of trying to control something you can't, or conversely, not controlling something that you could. But in this context, talking about rumination, the key discrimination question is, how do you know when it's useful analysis and when it's useless rumination? And I will answer that for you. If it doesn't lead to timely, effective action, then it's useless rumination. Now that counters directly. Many therapists don't realize it and they're not familiar with this literature. How many therapists actually unintentionally, unwittingly encourage rumination? And in fact, the more analytic you are in your orientation, the more likely you are to encourage people to think and analyze and think and analyze. And certainly what we've learned along the way is there is definitely a danger in thinking too much. I like this cartoon that illustrates it well. She says, I'm a typical Jungian archetype demonstrating a variation of the Apollo-Daphne complex with repressed delusions. He says, I'm just a guy from Omaha. And if we ask the question, who is at greater risk for depression and anxiety? She is, not just because of gender, but because of her tendency to overthink, overanalyze. Said Socrates, the unexamined life isn't worth living. Said Yatko, neither is the overexamined life. So let me start to bring this to the level of practice then. I want to present to you 6 different ways to use hypnosis that can have the potential to get people moving. One of the ways I sequenced for you earlier, you'll have a chance to look the strategy over when you get your download the slides, but it's hypnotically building expectancy. And honestly, I spent many, many years experimenting and experimenting and experimenting with different variations of how can I get people absorbed in the notion that the future holds the potential for successes if you do things differently. One of the things that really shocked me was Aaron Beck happened to have been one of my mentors as well. And I happen to love cognitive therapy, and there's nobody better at explaining than Tim was. And besides being a superb clinician and theorist, he was probably the only guy in the world who could look really cool wearing a bow tie. So when one time I sat in on one of his sessions, and it was with a young college kid who was socially isolated, socially phobic, and of course the structure of social phobia, anticipating rejection, and so avoiding it. So I had never seen him do anything like this, but he invited this young man to close his eyes and start to imagine himself going back to the dorm where he was living, the college dorm where he was living, and meet people in the hallway and stop them and ask them how their classes are going. And Friday night when everybody's rocking and rolling and partying, and he'd make a point of walking in there and having a number of things that he could raise as topics and engage. And you literally watch this kid go from being so uptight and so tense, and watching him even have small smiles on his face. And when he sat up and opened his eyes from this imagery exercise, he literally said, well, I think I can do that. And off he went, a happy guy. And I turned to Beck and I asked, what was that? In the hypnotic world, that's what you call a hypnotic age progression. Beck called it a success imagery. I don't really care what you call it. It doesn't matter to me if you call it Ralph. I'm just interested in the structure of it, of how do you engage somebody and associate them to the idea that they can take action that results, sensible action that results in a potential of good success. The second strategy that I alluded to, seeding homework as a vehicle of learning valuable skills. Now, if you're not the kind of person who's creative and you're not great at generating homework assignments, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. In my book, Breaking the Patterns of Depression, I have nearly 100 exercises that if you want to teach your client this particular skill, you can use this exercise. You want to teach them that skill, you can use that one. So you can beg, borrow, and steal assignments from my book as well as many other books, and from Erickson's work as well. One of the strongest aspects, if not the strongest aspect of hypnosis, is the value of dissociation. Now, when you study hypnosis and you really get what hypnosis is about, you recognize that dissociation is foundational. And when I talk about dissociation, I mean breaking global experiences into their component parts. That's the textbook definition of dissociation. Breaking global experiences into their component parts. And there are many different types of dissociation. In this context, I'm talking about dissociating feelings from action. I wish I had $1 for every time I asked my depressed client to do something, and they say, yeah, I know that would be good for me to do, but I don't feel like it. Well, this is one of the great learnings from the world of affective neuroscience, how much a person's mood state influences their perceptions of memory, their perceptions of the future, their perceptions of controllability. And I need to help people by using hypnosis specifically to filter the feelings out of the interaction. What is the action that's going to lead to success? So that, as you can tell, is directly contradicting all the therapists who place such a premium on talking about your feelings and exploring your feelings and validating your feelings. And I'm saying, put them aside. If you wait until you feel like doing the dishes, you're not gonna. If you wait until you feel like it, it's not going to happen. And the idea of using hypnosis to prioritize a result over the feeling. The induction of affect, use of hypnosis to amplify curiosity. Erickson used to do that all the time. He'd give somebody a homework assignment, and if they started to balk at it, he'd simply say, well, you never really know what good's going to come from it, do you? Amplify curiosity as a way of getting the person to engage. Age progressing, the consequences of inertia. What happens if you don't change things? Success imagery is great, but this is the flip side. What happens if you don't change what you're doing? And that becomes for some people a very motivating kind of thing. And then the last one, the use of metaphors that address inactivity and watch it evolve into a goal orientation. And the value of stories that basically speak to try and fail, try and fail, try and succeed. And as a vehicle of building frustration tolerance, staying with it to completion. Here again is another strategy that I've given you a step-by-step sequence for. Initially, I was under the impression that we would have a practice session during this meeting today, but it didn't work out time-wise. So I still wanted to include for you a couple of strategies that if and when you get a chance to practice it, that you can evolve this particular skill set. In the month of May, I was fortunate enough to spend the month in Africa. And I was in South Africa and Botswana and Zimbabwe. And this tribal saying from a group in Zimbabwe really captured my attention. If you can walk, you can dance. If you can talk, you can sing. And I think that is a particularly poetic way of saying you're capable of doing more. You're capable of doing more. And isn't that the attitude that anyone who practices hypnosis has? The whole reason we do hypnosis is because we know people have resources that they're just not using. So I hope you enjoy that particular saying. Well, that's the 45 minutes to the minute later, the end of my formal remarks and things I want to tell you about before I open it up to questions. As Peter mentioned, for years and years now, I've been running a signature 100-hour training, which many of you took. And as you may know, I'm starting to slow myself down a little bit. And so the idea of condensing it into 60 hours and what I'm not going to be presenting that was part of the 100-hour class was the role of hypnosis in behavioral medicine. So this course that begins in April is just going to be focused on the use of hypnosis in strategic psychotherapies. I will be teaching many different strategies. The star of the show are the practice sessions where you get a chance to do the strategy and then we debrief it in detail. There will be demonstrations, there will be modeling, there will be all the things that you would expect, but it's a very comprehensive 60 hours in 3 phases of 20 hours each. So if that's of interest to you, the link is going to be in the chat. You'll also find it on my website, yapco.com. If you click on the tab 2025 Hypnosis Training. I'm honored to have been asked to present the keynote address next month for the Society for Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis. The meeting's live in Anaheim. And if you've been looking for a live meeting to connect with key members of the hypnosis community, then you might want to consider coming to Anaheim. You can feel free to detour to Disneyland, but it should be a great meeting, and I'm pleased to be there. And then the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis meeting, I will be delivering the keynote address for that meeting which will be taking place in March. And that meeting will be entirely virtual. I've already mentioned the 6th edition of my widely used hypnosis textbook, Trance Work. And for this edition, for the first time in my life, I took on a co-author, a very capable psychologist by the name of Sean Criswell. She is very knowledgeable, very perceptive, and it was a pleasure to do this major project with her. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to mention was Claria. I have been working with an Australian digital therapeutic company called Mindset Health for the last 3 years. And I have developed, based on my in-depth knowledge of depression and anxiety, what some of the core patterns are that represent good mental health. And there are 12 hypnosis sessions, each targeting the building of a specific skill set. So one of the sessions builds on building positive expectancy. One of the sessions focuses on tolerating ambiguity, and on and on. I want to share with you that for you as a healthcare professional, you can have access to Claria on a free basis. It won't cost you anything. And of course, the transparent motive for that is if you like it and when you like it, that you will then recommend Claria to your clients who will pay a small annual fee to have full access 24/7 to these recordings that can support therapy if your clients use it in between sessions. And of course, most depressed people won't seek therapy. So it's reaching people that would never see the inside of a mental health professional's office. So the details for how to access Claria, here you are getting a first glimpse of the new book cover. Nobody else has seen it yet. Consider yourself lucky there. But here is a description in your handouts of Claria, and here are the instructions for how to get it for free for your own use. And Mindset Health offers not only Claria, but they offer some other programs as well. Nerva, which is for irritable bowel syndrome, and Gary Elkins, who's the editor of the International Journal, has done a couple of programs for them on stopping smoking and reducing postmenopausal or menopausal hot flashes. So you'll have access to all of those programs. I urge you and welcome you to explore mindsethealth.com and read more about it on my website. So there, I'm now happy to open it up to your questions.
Okay. If you have questions, oh, I'm sorry, Michael.
Contact information on that are also in the handouts. Okay, questions and answers.
Okay, a number of questions, a bunch of questions came in, and for those of you who have other questions, please send them over to me. I'll try to keep an eye on both what we're doing as well as the question. Michael, from Leslie Thayer, what do you see as the next most growing area of research in clinical hypnosis?
Well, first of all, hi, Leslie. Nice to hear from you indirectly. What if we look at the trend that has evolved over the last 5 years in particular? Hypnosis has been heavily pushed to become more empirically based. And so if we take the impoverished nature of some of the hypnosis literature, so for example, my area of focus has been hypnosis and treating depression. Now, in 2010, the International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis editor, Arid Barbash, invited me to guest edit a special issue on treating depression with hypnosis. 2010, that was the first time that the topic had been raised. And just this year, I guest edited 2 special issues of the American Journal of Clinical Hypnosis, First came out in April, the second came out in July, both issues presenting diverse considerations of the use of hypnosis in treating depression. What I see happening is as the push for greater empiricism grows, the researchers formed a hypnosis research task force and provided guidelines for conducting research. And so clinicians are going to be tasked, supposedly, with doing more single case studies and publishing more research and using simple paradigms to get empirical validation. I also see that there will be many more diverse applications. This has been really encouraging to me, and I've loved seeing how the field of hypnosis has been spreading out into areas that never were considered targets for hypnosis. And that diversity I expect to continue. But I also see how artificial intelligence is going to play a role in how hypnosis sessions are constructed and delivered on a more widespread basis. And I'm hoping Peter Gardner will talk to you all about that one day. His expertise in artificial intelligence in the domain of hypnosis is information that I think is important and should be shared. So those are the things that I see unfolding over the next few years. I think that COVID changed things radically. It's one of the things that I had to take into account in the new 6th edition of Transwork. When the 5th edition came out in 2019, it was pre-COVID. And if you had asked hypnosis practitioners in 2018, so what about doing hypnosis online? They would have said, no way, the majority of them. And now it's mainstream. Now that's a huge change in how healthcare is delivered, especially hypnosis sessions through telehealth. And so I expect that to continue to expand and more research becoming available about what factors to consider when conducting hypnosis sessions online.
So, Michael, a question had come up the other day about the effectiveness of hypnosis online versus in person. And so I did a quick AI search, and with references, it was almost crystal clear that they were equally effective.
That is what my research has shown as well. And interesting also, in the international survey that I referenced earlier and gave you the reference on Paulson's work, that was one of the questions that he asked in his international survey of practitioners. How do you feel telehealth compares to live sessions? And the overwhelming majority of practitioners said no difference as far as they could tell in clinical practice. But under controlled conditions, there have now been a number of studies addressing that exact question empirically, and there is fundamentally no significant difference. But there are special considerations to take into account, and those are ones that I elaborate in the book, and also on the ASH website. They have provided telehealth guidelines that I think are useful for conducting hypnosis sessions.
From someone else, Michael, how do you address the challenges of treating depression in our increasingly digital and socially isolated world?
Well, you've put your finger on one of the toughest things that there is. I don't know how many of you are aware that this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, the Milton Erickson Foundation is running a 2-day conference specifically on the topic of treating anxiety and depression. And I am really pleased that I'm doing the kickoff keynote address Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And that is the topic I'm addressing. My topic is depression is contagious. And I'm talking about the fact that we have medicalized depression, the fact that people call depression a mental illness and want to treat it with drugs has really made things much worse. And the flip side relates to your question. If we don't understand the role of technology, if we don't understand how social media is impacting young people, And they are the fastest growing demographic group of depression sufferers, young people. And the fact that they are the fastest growing group is obviously very problematic, because we know longitudinally that when you suffer depression as an adolescent, it sets you up for a lifetime of relapses. And so this is not a good prognosis for them. Even worse, if you're worried about today's 15-year-old, today's 17-year-old's depression, what happens 10 years from now when they have kids? We already have the evidence that the rate of depression doubles to triples from one generation to the next. Depression becomes more common, it becomes more pervasive, it becomes more severe. So the single person I think who has had the greatest amount to say about this that is sensible is a San Diego State psychologist, researcher by the name of Jean Twenge, Twenge. If you have not read any of Jean's books, hurry up and read them. She wrote The Narcissism Epidemic. She wrote The Me Generation. Her most recent book is called Generations. And she is a brilliant researcher. And more importantly, she makes it so practical. Now, beyond her writings, the American Academy of Pediatrics recently provided their very specific guidelines to parents for how they should manage their kids' use of social media. The American Psychological Association published guidelines for how to help kids manage social media. These are free resources that you will find on their websites. And I think every practitioner should read the guidelines at least twice and think about how to translate that message into a hypnosis session for a 15-year-old, about how they should come to understand why comparing themselves to others isn't a good idea, how they can come to understand that TikTok isn't real, and that all those people that are smiling and happy on Facebook are half a step away from killing themselves, that things are not the way they seem. And that is, unfortunately, this is my opinion now, feel free to disagree. I blame our educational system in large part that our kids have not learned to think critically. We have trained people to be believers instead of thinkers. And we're seeing that play out in our political climate. You have people who believe things that are nothing short of preposterous. And not only do they believe it, but they're willing to hurt other people in the name of that belief. And the inability to distinguish what's real from what's not, what's sensible from what's not. How many kids have died taking the TikTok challenge? I mean, it's really something that we have not addressed. And in the educational system, teachers say, well, I'm not a therapist, and I understand that. But where else are people going to learn these skills? So, kind of a long-winded answer there, but the answer is really twofold, that there are plenty of really smart people who have given deep thought to how to manage social media. And you'll find a lot of their guidelines in the resources that I've mentioned, American Psych Association, American Academy of Pediatricians. And then the best thing that you can do is take each one of those recommendations and think about how would you impart that message in a hypnosis session to a 15-year-old who doesn't get it. And when you've given it that much thought and you've developed strategies for communicating those ideas, then you're going to be able to do some very impactful work. We're not going to change the world. The technology is not going away, and with AI, it's going to get even more pronounced. Without people having the ability to think their way through it, we're all in danger.
Thank you. From Rob Staffen, what is the mutative element in the therapeutic process?
What is the
mutative element? What is it? Sorry. Rob, do you want to
explain the question to me?
Hi, Michael. What is it that promotes change? Now, prior to your presentation, I was curious about your answer, but listening to your presentation, I think I know your answer.
And what is it?
Well, getting people to do things.
Well, yeah. Getting people to, if you think about what makes hypnosis work, hypnosis doesn't cure anything. Hypnosis isn't what's curative. It's what happens during hypnosis that has therapeutic potential. And what hypnosis does is it builds new associations. It encourages connection to resources, but that's the building of a new association. And that's what work is meant to do, homework is meant to do, experiences are meant to do, or build new associations, new ways of thinking about things, new ways of approaching things. That's what's therapeutic. The fact that you do a hypnotic induction, that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. You know, the hypnosis session has to have some linkages that it builds in the person's mind, and not just during the hypnosis itself. That's the function of the post-hypnotic suggestion then, is how do we take these new associations evolving during the hypnosis session and extend them outwards into the rest of the person's life. And that's what a good post-hypnotic suggestion will do, and that's what a good homework assignment will do.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, Michael. With the rise of AI and virtual reality in mental health care, do you see a future where technology could complement or even replace aspects of hypnosis?
It's an interesting question, and I hadn't really thought about it until this past December. I was honored to be faculty on the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference for the 4th or 5th time. And Martin Seligman was one of the keynote speakers, and I've known Marty for probably 30 years, but I hadn't seen him in a couple of years. And in the interim, he had gotten a cochlear implant, and he was looking older, feeling older. But he told the story, not just to me, but as part of his keynote address, that a group in China had taken all of his books, all of his articles, all of his lectures, pumped them into the computer, and developed an AI program called Ask Marty. And it was an advice program that you could ask questions and ask for help, and you get an answer in the voice of Martin Seligman. So he decided to be the first person to try it. So he wrote to Ask Marty, and he wrote, I'm 83 years old and I've just gotten a cochlear implant, and it's harder for me to connect with people, and I'm slower than I was, and I can't be as active in my profession as I was, and I'm starting to feel older and useless. And so what would you recommend? And this AI program kicked out this 6-page single-spaced document that he read portions of to the whole audience. You might be interested in this. You can get the recording from the Erickson Foundation if you're interested to hear the whole thing. So it's fascinating. But this AI program kicked out the most empathetic, sensitive, sensible advice that, as he's reading it, you would swear that any really competent, sensitive therapist would have said exactly those things. And so Marty went out on a limb and he said, yeah, I can see a time 10 years from now when therapists are obsolete. Now, personally, I don't believe that. I don't think, I think computers can complement and they can supplement, but I don't think they can replace. There's still nothing like a smile, and there's still nothing like a gleam in your eye, and there's still nothing like shining the spotlight of your consciousness on your client, giving this person attention that they so desperately want and need. So I think it'll be a great assist, but I don't think it'll be a replacement.
There was just an article in one of the medical journals the other day that when doctors sit down when talking to patients, patient satisfaction soared.
Right.
And to your point of a smile, I don't think we'll get a smile from the health computer of 2001. I think looking at AI, looking at voice intonations, pitch, speed, reading galvanic responses from afar, give us a lot of information. How we use that, probably only AI is fast enough to use that information to give us ideas. But
You better get yourself on the schedule to talk about this stuff, Peter.
I don't know. I don't know. Next question for you. Is EMDR and brain spotting, are they less common in other countries where hypnosis is more valued?
These are technologies, therapeutic approaches that have worked their way around the world. In many ways, a lot of different therapies have their point of origin here in the United States. At last count, I've been told there are more than 800 distinct forms of psychotherapy. And of course, each has their own advocates. Do we really need that many? It's debatable, it's arguable. But these are approaches that are used in other countries. Cognitive therapy is particularly popular in other countries. So the range of therapeutic approaches is available worldwide. Which ones become popular, which ones become more heavily relied on, certainly is a reflection of that culture's values.
I want to get back to that one in a second, but there's a good question about self-hypnosis, and it's often promoted as a tool for personal empowerment. However, is there a risk that promoting self-hypnosis could lead to individuals bypassing necessary professional guidance, potentially leading them to harm? And how do you advocate for the responsible use of self-hypnosis?
How far can self-hypnosis go? One of the things that all of us brush up against are our blind spots. The things that we don't know about ourselves, the things that we don't understand about ourselves, the things that we distort about ourselves. It's very hard to have an accurate self-image. We either tend to underestimate or overestimate ourselves in particular areas. So depending on how you encourage self-hypnosis, under what conditions you encourage self-hypnosis, under what guidelines you provide for self-hypnosis, it's not, I don't think of it as having any inherent dangers, but it depends on how you framed it for people. Can people deceive themselves? Yes, people do routinely. Can people justify bad behavior? Yes, they do routinely. So depending, and I would say the same point, not just about self-hypnosis, I'd say about hypnosis in general. Anything that has the potential to help has the potential to harm. That's a given. Hypnosis is not an innately benign intervention. Can people get harmed by hypnosis? Well, it's not the hypnosis that's potentially harmful. It's the way they use it. It's what they focus people on. It's what they tell them. And when you have someone who uses hypnosis, for example, to encourage people to go through past lives, for example, this is not an empirically validated treatment. It's not even a sensible treatment. So can it be helpful to some people who find it spiritually satisfying? Yes. Does that justify its use? Arguable. But can you take people back to traumas and re-traumatize them through age regression? Absolutely. So it's not the hypnosis itself, it's not the self-hypnosis itself, it's how people apply it. So if you're going to teach your clients self-hypnosis, and I think everyone should, it should be a routine intervention to help people learn to regulate their anxiety, regulate their physiology. but we certainly don't want people deceiving themselves, amplifying those deceptions, and going out into the world thinking that somehow they're immune from the things that affect everybody else.
Hypnosis is said to tap into the brain's neuroplasticity. How do you see hypnosis influencing neural pathways differently from other therapeutic interventions? And what evidence supports the unique impact of hypnosis on brain function? And I'm going to tag on to that, Michael. The studies a while back looking at the different part of the brains that were activated with hypnosis. I'm going to do visual imagery, meditation, mindfulness. Maybe you can comment on all of that.
Maybe I could. Then maybe I couldn't. Look, the fact that people suggest that hypnosis is a pathway for neuroplasticity, I don't have any difficulty with that conceptually. You as a clinician sitting in your office are very unlikely to have an fMRI machine in your office, or a CAT scanner, or a SPECT scanner, or any other scanner. And you can speculate about what's going on in people's brains. But all the client's interested in is, what do I have to do to feel better? Now, I have a passing interest. I will admit it's only a superficial interest in the neuroscience of hypnosis. I cover it in detail in the book only because I have to, but it isn't where I would want people to focus. The things that are fascinating to me are the studies that highlight through the scanning technologies the kinds of interesting things happening for people. For example, one of the most interesting studies I've read in recent years was one that came out of University of Oslo in Norway, where there was a study involving pupillometrics, the measurement of the pupil of the eye. So before hypnosis, they take the measurement of the pupil of the eye of research subjects. Then they say, okay, now we're going to increase the brightness of the light, and we'll measure again. And as you know, when the pupil of the eye is exposed to bright light, it will constrict, get smaller. And when the light dims, the pupil will dilate, increase in size. So they now have a baseline, how much the person's pupil expands, how much it constricts under changed lighting conditions. Then they induced hypnosis. Then they said, okay, now once again, we're going to measure your pupil under different conditions. So they take the measurement of the pupil, and then they again say, okay, now once again, we're going to increase the light intensity. Okay, now once again, we're going to decrease the light intensity. And what they measured was that the pupil of the eye would constrict when it was suggested the light was brighter. The pupil of the eye dilated when it was suggested that the light was dimmed. And in actuality, they never changed the lighting at all. People responded at the level of the autonomic nervous system to the suggested reality, not the objective reality. Now, there have been studies that have been done. David Spiegel and Stephen Kessler did the study at Harvard about exposure to color in black and white abstract pictures while in a PET scanner, positron emission tomography. So they said, baseline, take a look at this card. It's black and white, and they look at which part of the brain becomes active, which part of the visual cortex becomes active. Then they say, okay, give us back that card. Now we're going to show you a color card. And then they see that a different part of the visual cortex becomes active. Then they do the hypnotic induction. Then they give the suggestion, okay, now we're going to show you once again the color card, when in actuality, they show them the black and white card. Can you predict which part of the visual cortex lit up? Once again, they responded to the suggested reality of the color card instead of the actual reality of the black and white card. Very interesting experiment in the neuroscience of color modulation processing. So, the neuroscience is interesting, but that isn't the most salient point. What I hope you're getting from this little answer I'm giving you is I'm talking about how the mind changes the brain instead of thinking about how the brain itself functions as if it doesn't respond to suggestion and the changes that take place through suggestion. So my bottom line is just do good therapeutic work. And if it makes you think that you're creating neuroplasticity in the process, then go ahead and enjoy that thought.
Another question came in. Many therapeutic approaches focus on short-term symptom relief. How do you ensure that hypnosis provides lasting changes in patients, and what evidence is there to support the long-term efficacy of hypnosis versus other therapies?
Well, number of things. I mean, this is one of the things that clinicians can do to make their therapies that much more empirically sound. That's what follow-ups are for. Now, if you go to the Erickson Foundation or you go to my website, you will see that I have been filmed doing therapy sessions many times. And when I then add to the session follow-ups, what goes on for this person a month later, what goes on 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later. I have as much as 19 years follow-up on some of the patients I've worked with. So that's how you find out, is it enduring? But your question reflects what was one of the main criticisms of hypnosis for nearly a century. People who dismissed hypnosis as merely a temporary fix. And they weren't wrong. But one of the things that we didn't understand about hypnosis until relatively recently, I'm talking 1970s now, was the aspect of hypnosis known as state specificity. That the person would generate the response during the hypnosis session, and then as soon as the hypnosis session ended, it was gone. So in other words, to be concrete about it, you're doing a session with somebody who has physical pain. You do a hypnosis session that involves the use of analgesia or anesthesia. You're able to generate pain relief. The person comes out of hypnosis and boom, the pain is right back again. Unless you are deliberate in your use of post-hypnotic suggestions that are meant to help generalize what you've accomplished into the rest of the person's life. It's one of the questions that people ask all the time. So how long does a hypnotic suggestion last? And my standard flippant response is, how long does a good idea last?
And one more question for you. How do you approach treatment when a patient is unresponsive to hypnosis or the suggestions given? What alternative strategies do you employ, and how do you address the disappointment or skepticism that might arise from such situations?
You're asking a pretty complicated question because it involves many different moving parts of what makes hypnosis effective in the first place. First, one of the very few things that everyone in the field agrees with is the observation that people differ in their hypnotic capabilities. And of course, based in the research, the lab research of more than 100 years of people testing different suggestibility tests specifically designed to measure someone's capacity for hypnosis. Now, interestingly, in the survey, the International Survey of Practitioners, very few respondents, I mean, very few respondents use suggestibility testing at all. And that, of course, drew some pretty strong reactions. I don't know if you know John Kielstrom. John is he's now retired, but brilliant hypnosis researcher who was at UC Berkeley. And when this study got published about how few therapists were using suggestibility testing, well, it's a little strong to say that he threw an intellectual tantrum, but it was in that realm that he couldn't understand why therapists weren't measuring suggestibility. And he, quoted Hilgard that if somebody's not capable of hypnosis, then why do hypnosis with them? But understand that what one person deems unhypnotizable, somebody else might do a totally different approach with and find very responsive. And that's the first question for you to consider. When somebody doesn't respond to hypnosis, is that a statement about them? Is that a statement about your approach? And until you experiment with different approaches, and until you go through the measures of teaching this person self-hypnosis and giving them the opportunity to practice, you'd be surprised. And if you look at the literature on this, can you take someone who is a low hypnotizable, quote unquote, low hypnotizable, and turn them into a medium hypnotizable? There are quite a few studies that have claimed that they can do that, and they explain how. So first point is, I'm not that quick to dismiss someone as unhypnotizable. It depends on whether your technique is artificial or naturalistic. It depends what you define as an adequate hypnotic response. Now, let's assume for the moment you're correct, that you've done some really good thinking about and planning for and good design and good delivery, and this person just isn't particularly responsive. Well, the question is, so what does that mean? One of the things that people learn when they have gone through training with me is that, yes, we place an emphasis on tailoring your approach to the individual. But the question then is, how do you assess the individual to know what's going to be the most useful or likely to succeed approach? And that's when I get into the specificity of, we have to assess while we're doing the clinical interview, what is this person's cognitive style? What is this person's attributional style? What is this person's relational style? What is this person's attentional style? And anybody who's been doing hypnosis, virtually every person on this call right now has had sessions that they do with someone where they do a hypnosis session and it goes on for 15 or 20 minutes. And then when it's over, the person sits up and opens their eyes. And then you ask them, so how was that? And they say, fine. Well, can you describe some of your experience for me? It was relaxing. Can you tell me anything more about what went on for you? It was pleasant. Can you tell me anything about any, and you want to tap them on the forehead and say, is anybody in there? And so part of what you have to recognize early on is this the kind of person who has the capacity for introspection, who has the capacity to go inside and actually find something in there? There are a lot of people who are paper thin, people who don't have the depth. They're not insightful. They're not going to think about these things. And so as an alternative, when you recognize this is one of those people, at least here at this point, maybe they'll become more insightful. Maybe they'll become more aware as therapy goes on. But those are the folks that instead of trying to promote insights and understandings, those are the folks that you work with behaviorally. How can I get them to do things? How can I get them to engage in behaviors that will be likely to interrupt the sequence of what they're doing that's problematic for them? And so that's when the kinds of things that we've talked about today of getting people to be action-oriented is perfect. This person isn't thoughtful, but they know how to carry out the assignment you gave them. And then there's something to debrief, but you're going to have to provide guidelines for them. Now, it depends also how intense you are about getting someone to be able to respond hypnotically. When you read Erickson's work, there were people that he worked with for dozens of sessions, just trying to get them to produce a decent hypnotic experience before he ever attempted to use it. And that's one of the mistakes that people make, that they're attempting to use the hypnosis before they've developed it. And that's what sets up failure, and that's when people give up on hypnosis. That very first session, you didn't read the person very well, you did an induction, you tried to generate an arm levitation or a glove anesthesia, they didn't get it. And now they think, well, I guess I can't be hypnotized. That's putting the cart before the horse. And it's why, again, my students here have heard this a million times, and they've seen me do it a million times. How often when I begin a hypnosis session, the first words out of my mouth are, I don't know. I don't know just when you're going to want to let your eyes close. I don't know just what the most comfortable position is for you to sit in. I don't know just what you're going to discover that will be useful to you. Now notice the presuppositions. And I'm just being honest. I don't know. I don't know what their hypnotic talents are. There's no way to predict. The suggestibility test that's still the gold standard is the Stanford scale. Andre Weizenhofer and Ernest Hilgard spent decades developing that test. Well, both Hilgard and Weizenhofer were mentors of mine. Andre was a friend. In fact, wrote the foreword to the second edition of my book. And Andre and I would get along so well until the topic of suggestibility testing would come up. And Andre would say to me in his inimitable French accent, Michael, you write the hypnosis textbooks, you teach hypnosis all over the world. Why aren't you teaching people to use my test? And I would say to him, Andre, I love you a lot, but the test is useless clinically. It has no predictive clinical value. He hated that answer. And then when he retired and Hilgard retired and they closed the Stanford lab, Andre moved to a small town in Colorado, Nathrop, Colorado, population 78 elk, and he opened a small clinical practice. And wasn't even 3 months later, he calls me up and he says, now I see what you're talking about. And then he even put it in writing in the second edition of his book, The Practice of Hypnotism, that unless you have some empirical need to test, it really isn't relevant for clinical practice. But it's an important point that people differ in their capabilities. Someone may not be a great hypnotic subject. They might be a great one, but there's no way to predict before you do it. And so my advice to you, long-winded, is when you begin your hypnosis sessions, to leave room for individual responses. That it truly is honest to say, I really don't know what you're going to discover. I don't know what the depth is of what you're going to experience. And you get to create the experience and you get to participate in it. And I wonder where you'll take it. Presupposition, you're going to take it someplace. And when somebody doesn't respond particularly well, to prepare someone for the range of responses. everybody's had that experience. Somebody sits up, opens their eyes, and says, "Well, I don't think I was hypnotized. I heard everything you said." As if somehow they were expecting to not be aware, that they were somehow going to be asleep or unconscious. Misconception. So that's another thing before you begin a hypnosis session, to gauge, to ask about what this person's understanding is. How important it is that as you're educating the person about the experience, you're really talking on two different levels. On one level, you're just imparting didactic information about hypnosis, but on another level, you're already doing the induction.
I saw very quickly, and I'll be very brief, someone had looked at AI to create a hypnotic session, and I would only caution, there was an article recently where I think it was Meta's AI, Facebook's AI, played a game of diplomacy. I'm not familiar with the game, with another AI, and basically it was either Meta's or the others lied to win the game. And so it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder whether, when in fact we start putting together hypnotic sessions based on AI, how much I was going to say how much damage, not damage, how directed it will do, and is it smarter than we are at knowing where it's going to take it? I don't know. Maybe it's a question for AI, right?
Time will tell. Time will
Michael,
tell.
I can't thank you enough. We've gone through most of the questions that I got. As usual, I mean, you covered so much in a short period of time, and just tapping into that wealth of knowledge and experience is amazing. Thank you so much for coming back, for helping, and
Thanks for inviting me. It's been my pleasure.
I do want to say that I see a couple of notes in the chat asking where we can find the slides, a link to the 60-hour course, and the and Claria, and it's in there. And I think I saw at some point, Diane, you put your email address in there for people if they had issues with Claria. But if you go back to the beginning of the chat, I think there are links for all three of those in there. So again, thank you. And John?
Yeah, just to wrap up, thank you enormously, Peter, as always, and Lee, for your work that you're going to do after the fact, and Dana, who's been sneaking in and out intermittently as we go through. But Michael, you are a treasure, and tonight was such a gift, and thank you enormously.
Thank you so much.